Hello guys, welcome to another video. So we're getting more information about the Path of Exile 1 event that's coming up, and we actually get a name for it here, the Legacy of Phrecia event. So this is the 1 month event that GGG have announced where they're going to be changing every ascendancy class that exists in the game to be a different ascendancy class. And we're actually getting the information for the ascendancies before the event actually starts. This is something that I discussed in the previous video, whether that was going to happen or not. And to be honest with you, they're going a little bit more into it than I thought they would have. There's a couple of ascendancies being shown off in this post, and we actually get a little bit more of something at the end, which we'll discuss in just a moment. So we get, some information here about how the event is progressing, and we're going to get 2 ascendancies being showcased in this post, and more to come in the next week or so. So this is first the Harbinger ascendancy for the Witch. This one was already teased in the post, and we also get the Gambler ascendancy for the Duelist. So let's first take a look at the Harbinger ascendancy for the Witch. So this is really themed around those Harbinger items that already exist in the game, and there's lots of kind of ideas being pulled from those, and even skills that already exist on those items being reused in this ascendancy. And I think that's actually quite a cool idea, because a lot of those items have kind of interesting things going on with them, but in a lot of cases, people just don't use those items because, there's too much competition on a particular gear slot, and so they just don't get used. And there's actually some really nice things going on here with this ascendancy. So let's begin first with this node up here, which is 30% increased energy shield recovery rate and 30% increased mana recovery rate. So what these modifiers are going to do is boost any overtime recovery you get for both of those stats. So for energy shield, this could be things like energy shield leech, energy shield regen, or energy shield recharge. All of those things are recovery over time, and as long as it's recovering over time there, you're going to be able to boost it up by at least 30%. This will be additive with any other modifiers that you have to energy shield recovery rate. And there's also the mana recovery rate modifier there. So, mana regen or mana recovery from a flask, for example, as long as it's not instant and it's over time, that's going to be boosted up by that. And mana leech as well, as long as that's not instant. So that's actually a really strong buff here, and this is quite a strong node. It depends on how you're going to be able to use this exactly and what build you go for, but I actually think this one's quite strong. And after that, we get this node here, which is grants Summon Greater Harbinger of the Arcane skill. And this one I think is actually a little bit weak for a secondary node. Perhaps there should have been something else on this node. So here is the Summon Greater Harbinger of the Arcane. And what this skill is going to essentially do is it summons an immortal Harbinger minion. This thing just follows you around. It can't be targeted by monsters or anything like that. It just follows around behind you, and it occasionally casts a skill on you, which grants you a buff. And in the case of this minion here, this one grants you Arcane Surge, and it also grants you a secondary buff as well. So Arcane Surge, obviously just some cast speed and mana regen, and that one lasts for 4 seconds with an 8-second cooldown. And then the secondary buff here is a buff that originally comes from the Surging Thoughts. That's, the unique item. But this one grants you 15% chance to shock and 10% lightning pen. So that's a pretty weak buff overall. I would say, these two things, you can get Arcane Surge elsewhere in the game, and this buff isn't particularly strong. So I would say that the first node there that comes off this branch, the energy shield recovery rate and the mana recovery rate, that's actually really strong. But this secondary skill, I'm not really convinced this is going to be all too useful. Now, going on to the next branch here, we can take a look at this cooldown recovery rate branch. So this one is 40% increased cooldown recovery rate. That is actually really, really powerful. That is a lot of CDR on one node, and you can do some pretty crazy stuff with this. So that's really, really fun there. And coming off of this, you get the grants Summon Greater Harbinger of Time skill. So let's take a look at exactly what the Greater Harbinger of Time does. This is a buff that comes from the Flow Untethered, which I believe is a belt. And what this does is it grants you an action speed boost. So you gain 10% increased action speed. It lasts for 8 seconds with a cooldown of 20 seconds. So this actually used to be a lot stronger, but it got nerfed a while back. And this is a nice action speed boost. But again, on a second branch ascendancy, I'm not sure if this is that good. It's a 40% uptime on a 10% increased action speed boost. So it is okay, but it's not that great. Really, the 40% CDR, once again, is really strong. So it's nice to see that, these nodes, you have options to be able to take the first ascendancy and then not take the second one, but I would like to see a little bit more going on with these second ascendancy nodes. But still, the 40% increased CDR is going to be absurdly strong. And then we get another branch down here, which this one is actually really, really powerful, and this one kind of combos off with the other things going on in the ascendancy. So first of all, we get this node right here, which is buffs on you expire 30% slower, and debuffs on you expire 30% faster. That is extremely strong in and of itself, because, you know, things like Temporal Chain's Self-Curse is a thing in Path of Exile where you're able to increase the duration of particular things, you know, stacking on you so that they last longer. And this is essentially the same thing as that, but with Temporal Chains, it's a 25% slower expiry rate of any kind of effect that is existing on that entity, and that is baseline. It's halved baseline on players, which means if you self-curse with Temporal Chains, you're getting, you know, half of that effect. You can see that here, 50% less curse effect on players. So it goes from 25% down to 12.5%. That's baseline before you start scaling curse effects. So this node is already providing 30% slower expiry rate, which is a lot. And that means that if you actually take this in combination with this Summon Greater Harbinger of Time skill, you can boost this up from a 40% uptime to about 57% uptime. So you're going to have quite a bit better uptime on that skill. Even more if you go for something like a self-curse Temporal Chain setup, but that is something that you can be aware of, that you can actually combine this node, you know, with all of these different Harbinger skills, and they'll have better uptime. And one other thing to mention about this node here is that, unlike Temporal Chains, where it's all effects on you that have a slower expiry rate, this one is only slowing the expiry rate of buffs, and it's speeding up the expiry rate of debuffs, which means that it's actually inherently a lot stronger than Temporal Chains, because, you know, with Temporal Chains, it doesn't really care if it's a buff or a debuff, it's always going to make that thing slow down the expiry. And for this one, it's a little bit better there, unless you were trying to do some kind of self-ailment thing where you're kind of like self-chilling or, you know, self-poison or things like that, in which case this is a bit of a hindrance and you're going to have to overcome that downside if you were looking to do something like that. Now, coming off of this branch is the third Harbinger on this ascendancy, which is the Summon Greater Harbinger of Focus. And this one is quite interesting. So first of all, let's take a look at exactly what it does. Now, what this buff provides is significantly stronger, in my opinion, to the other two. This one is like ridiculous compared to the other two, in fact, when you actually look at exactly what it provides. So it's a 4-second buff with an 8-second cooldown. So it has about a 50% uptime. And it grants you immunity to all status ailments, immunity to stun, 20% damage reduction, that's everything, hits and damage over time, and immunity to curses. So with a 50% uptime, you'll have all of those buffs. Now, that is really strong, considering that actually it's going to have more than a 50% uptime, because of course it was preceded by this node right here, which makes buffs expire on you 30% slower, which means that instead of lasting 4 seconds, this is going to last about 5.7 seconds, and that's going to be about a 72% uptime. So that is already really strong. Now, the interesting thing here, though, is that this buff here makes you immune to curses, right? So you can no longer do any kind of self-curse Temporal Chains thing to make this last even longer. However, there is something interesting here that you could do. This is the Greater Harbinger of Focus skill. So let's just say you took this first node here, but you didn't take this second node behind it. And the reason you want to do that is perhaps if you wanted to use one of the Harbinger uniques. So the Immortal Will is the shield that provides this Greater Harbinger of Focus skill, but this shield is upgraded from the Unshattered Will. So this is the unupgraded version here. And this one grants the Summon Harbinger of Focus skill, not the Greater version. And what this buff does is essentially exactly the same, except for it doesn't have the curse immunity part. So you still have the immunity to all status ailments, you still have the stun immunity, you still have the 20% damage reduction, but you don't have the curse immunity. And that means that by using this shield, you can then also factor in self-curse Temporal Chains, and that would mean that you can actually have this buff up all the time, right? If you scale curse effect enough, you'll be able to have this buff up with 100% uptime, and that is actually really, really powerful. These are some ridiculous buffs, things like 20% DR is just something that you can't really get in many places in the game, especially considering it's not just a hit DR, it's also, you know, for damage over time as well. It's just for any damage that comes into the character. So that is one interesting thing that you could consider doing there. Now, moving on, we've got this node here, which is a channeling node. So this is kind of interesting. This is quite fun, actually, if you think about doing something like some kind of cyclone setup or something interesting there you could do, because it means that whenever you enter a map that's got like temporal chains, you can just completely ignore temporal chains and you still, you know, you're still able to move at full speed there. Or things like being unaffected by chill is really nice as well. You can just ignore chilled ground. So this is kind of a nice boost, and this is also a 1 branch node as well. So you can take this if you're interested in going for a channeling build, and there's some interesting things you can do with that. Now, the last node on this ascendancy is actually one of the most powerful ones, and is also another 1-point branch, and that is this one here, which is Temporal Chains has no reservation if cast as an aura, and 100% increased area effect of hex skills. This is already going to boost the area effect big time of any hex curses that you use. Naturally, you're going to use Temporal Chains as a aura along with Blasphemy, because it's free to use, right? You actually don't have to pay any kind of mana cost, you don't have to reserve any mana, and that's actually really, really strong, because a huge area around you is going to be affected by Temporal Chains. But once again, as I discussed the, you know, self-curse stuff, we should probably look at that. So what you could use is Rot Blood Promise, which is a ring that already has Blasphemy built into it, so you've got level 20 Blasphemy there. And this one also has Curse auras from Socrates skills also affect you. It does have a 20% reduced effect of curses on you, so you're obviously going to want to overcome that downside by gaining a bunch of increased curse effect, so that you're then able to get more of that slower expiry rate buff. And that is something that you could do there to, you know, kind of make use of this node and some of this other stuff at the same time. But do be aware, of course, that if you are doing self-curse temporal chains, you know, this is not the Juggernaut Ascendancy. You don't have access to anything like what the Trickster has or the Juggernaut. So you are going to have to use something to actually, you know, protect you from that. So you might have to use something like, for example, Kaum's Roots, which is, you know, some unique boots that make it so your action speed cannot be modified below base value. But remember, they don't give you any movement speed, and they also don't have any sockets. And you can corrupt these for movement speed, but it's never going to be anything too significant compared to a normal pair of boots. So something to consider there, but you will have to be overcoming that downside of the action speed slow if you do go for a self-curse temporal chains setup. So that is the Harbinger Ascendancy. I think this one looks pretty fun overall, and there is some interesting things you can do there. And let's move on to the next Ascendancy, which is the Gambler. So this is actually a duelist ascendancy. So we go from the top side of the tree there down to the bottom side of the tree. And, you know, this is the strength and dexterity starting area. So this is an ascendancy that's kind of themed around a lot of you either do something or you don't, that kind of stuff. It's a lot of chance-based things. So let's go through each of the nodes here. So to begin with, we've got Risk Aversion right here, which is a 1-point branch here. When I say 1 point, by the way, or 2 point, I mean in terms of notables. Obviously, this is 2 points spent. But Risk Aversion will provide 50% chance to avoid elemental ailments and 50% chance to avoid being stunned. This is just a really nice ascendancy node to have, especially being on a 1 notable branch, because this is going to be something really strong that you can grab early on, and you can essentially get your character to a point where you can actually spec out of this later on, you know, if you find other ways to solve elemental ailments and stun. But you can combine this with the Betrayal modifier on body armor that you can craft on body armor to provide up to 25% of each of these stats. That will already bring you to 75%, and you can finish off the remaining 25% for each, you know, from the passive tree or from Eldritch implicits or anything like that. And that will mean that you'll then be completely immune to all elemental ailments and stun. And that's just a really nice quality of life to have on an ascendancy. So Risk Aversion, immediately a really good node there, especially being just on the 1 notable branch. Next up, we have Growing Accumulator, which is then followed up by Spectacular Parlay. So Growing Accumulator is 15% chance to deal triple damage and 30% chance to deal double damage, but you deal 25% less damage. So notably here, the chance to deal triple and double damage is specific to hits, but this is going to make you deal 25% less damage for all of the damage you deal, not just hits, damage over time as well. And on average, this is around 16.6% more damage if you were to factor all of these mods in across, an infinite string of hits there. It's on average 16.6% more damage, which doesn't sound particularly strong, but actually this becomes very strong when you start to factor in non-damaging ailments. So this is mostly going to be shock and freeze. For shock, for example, when you land that triple damage hit, you're going to be able to inflict a large shock, and then when that large shock is actually on the monster, if you then land another triple damage hit, they then take damage amplified by that shock, which then has the potential to inflict an even larger shock. So there's that kind of ramping, scaling potential there with non-damaging ailments. And you can also say the same for freeze, where, whenever you actually do hit that triple damage, you are really ramping your damage to the point where you're bursting through that ailment threshold and you're able to freeze monsters much more easily. However, it doesn't stop there, because there's also the alt ailments that you could use. There's Brittle, Sap, and Scorch. All of those have the same sort of benefits. They're all non-damaging ailments that would really benefit from this triple damage hit. So Growing Accumulator really is, it's a decent damage node at 16.6% more damage on average, but the real strength of this node is with those non-damaging ailments. And then we have Spectacular Parlay, which is your critical strike chance is lucky, damage with hits is unlucky. What this node is essentially saying is you can invest significantly less into critical strike chance to be able to have, a high enough critical strike chance to almost confirm a crit on every hit, but your damage with hits is unlucky. Now, how you overcome the downside on this modifier is you either find a way to get lucky damage, and the only reason where I would kind of consider doing that is if I'm doing damage with a high damage variance, so things like lightning damage come to mind, where you have a very high variance, in which case the unlucky modifier is extremely punishing. Or you go down the route where you make a build that doesn't rely on a damage range at all. So for example, if you're using something like Bloodthirst support, which provides 2% of your maximum life as added physical damage with weapons while you're on low life, that is a flat damage number, it's not a damage range. And if you're using this with something like Pillar of the Caged Gods, for example, your actual damage range is almost non-existent. You basically just always hit for the same amount of damage, which means that the unlucky modifier here is not going to be particularly impactful to you. You then basically get to ignore this downside. Alright, next up we have Risky Exploit and Reversed Odds. So this is probably the strongest branch on this ascendancy. So first of all, Risky Exploit is minus 25% to all elemental resistances, which is quite a punishing downside, I would say. That's going to be, that's quite a lot of extra suffixes you need to take up there with resistances to be able to cap your resistances. But 50% chance for elemental resistances to be counted as 90% against enemy hits. Now, what this modifier essentially does is whenever an enemy hit comes in, you're going to flip a coin, and 50% of the time you're going to defend with your resistances on whatever value they are right now, and the other 50% of the time you're going to land on 90%. So on the average character that has 75% resistances, this modifier can be seen as, on average, plus 7.5% to maximum elemental resistances, right? Across many hits, on average, it's going to provide you with 7.5% to your maximum elemental resistances, and remember, it only works against hits. However, this modifier gets stronger and stronger the lower your maximum resistances are, because it ends up providing more and more value. So, for example, if you lower your maximum resistances with something like Lawweave, let's say that you have a low roll on this, right, and you have 70% maximum resistances, that means that whenever a hit comes in, it's a coin flip of a 50-50. You're either going to defend against that hit with 70% elemental resistances or with 90, which means that on average, that modifier is now providing you with an average of 10% maximum elemental resistances, up from the 7.5% if you had 75% max elemental resistances. Then there's also the Transcendence Timeless Keystone there, which imposes minus 15% to all maximum elemental resistances. And for example, if you were using that and you had your elemental resistances capped out at 60% and you were using this modifier, right, 50% of the time when a hit comes in, you're defending with 60% maximum elemental resistances, and the other 50% you're defending with 90%, and that's going to be an average of 15% maximum elemental resistances from that modifier. Now, you could even consider combining this with the Kiloarva's Bluster unique shield, which provides the same modifier and can roll up to 40% chance, which means at that point you'll have a 90% chance for this modifier to actually come into play, and that means that 90% of the time whenever a hit comes in, you're going to be defending with 90% elemental resistances, so that's quite a strong combination you could consider there. Moving on from Risky Exploit onto Reversed Odds, which is the node behind it, this is extremely powerful. So hits have a 50% chance to treat enemy monster elemental resistances as inverted, and there's already this exact stat on the passive tree on the Elemental Mastery, and that's the same stat for 25% chance, which means you can stack these two together for 75% chance to treat enemy monster elemental resistances as inverted. So whenever you come up against, monsters that don't have any resistances in maps, well, this modifier is going to do absolutely nothing, but that doesn't really matter because those monsters always die in one hit anyway. Where this modifier matters is against those monsters that do have resistances, so for example, pinnacle bosses that have 50% elemental resistance, or perhaps more notably, the monsters that you encounter in sort of, high tier maps when you're doing influenced farming, and you come across those altar monsters where you're adding a bunch of resistances, 80%, 80%, you're just adding tons and tons of resistances to them, and this is going to be able to invert those resistances, and whenever you come up against a rare that is resistant against your damage types, you're going to be able to basically just delete them, right? Which is something that is so powerful. And lastly, we have this branch right here, Overly Confident, and then the choice of heads or tails. So first of all, Overly Confident is damage of enemies hitting you is unlucky while you are on low life. Now this node is actually quite deceivingly strong, but it's kind of pigeonholed into one particular build archetype, and that's almost always going to be a life stacking low life build that uses Petrified Blood and maybe even uses Dissolution of the Flesh as well. So Petrified Blood, a reservation skill that essentially makes it so that you cannot recover above low life, and then whenever you do actually take hits, a portion of that hit damage is lost over time instead, and the rest of it is taken up front. When it comes to playing a Petrified Blood build and a life stacking build in general, most of the time you're going all in on life stacking, you're using things like Dissolution of the Flesh and Wrathpith Globe to try and stack as much life as possible. And most of the time, those builds don't actually have any options in terms of scaling defenses. Their only defensive layer is pretty much stacking as much life as possible, which usually ends up being, 3 or 4 times the amount of life of an average build. And at the top end is sometimes even 5 or 6 times the amount of life of an average build. So you could be seeing something between, 15,000 and 25,000 life on these types of builds. This kind of node is really strong because it's kind of an artificial mitigation layer. It means that the damage of hits coming into you, those enemy hits that are coming in, they're going to be rolled twice, and then the smaller value is going to be chosen. And obviously, this is stronger against some monsters, monsters that are dealing lightning damage with much larger ranges. This is going to be much stronger against those. But on average, this is actually quite a strong node to take on those kind of builds. Now, behind this, we have the heads and tails nodes. So you can go from this and you get to choose this. I assume that this small node is going to have some chance to block attack and spell damage, perhaps. And then you get a choice between heads or tails. So heads, chance to block spell damage is lucky, chance to block attack damage is unlucky, and for tails, it's the opposite way round. This is probably the weakest node on the entire ascendancy. It's kind of strange, I think, actually, especially considering I'm not really sure why this node is coming off of Overly Confident and not as a sort of standalone branch on its own. I think both of these nodes should have been just solo branches, because they don't really have any kind of relation to each other. There is a few things that you can do with this, so I'll just point those out. So first of all, heads, the chance to block spell damage is lucky, and chance to block attack damage is unlucky. You could make use of Sapphal's Frame with that. This is a unique shield that provides a bunch of maximum resistances. It also provides a lot of elemental resistances there as well. and it provides you with a chance to block spell damage, but it prevents you from blocking attack damage, which means that you can use this along with Tempest Shield, for example, to get your spell block chance up really high. You then only need a small amount of investment to be able to cap your spell block at 75%, at which point you'll then have 75% spell block and lucky spell block, which is absolutely absurd. That's actually the equivalent to having 94% chance to block spells, so that is really, really strong, and that's something that you can use there to make use of that node. However, there's another node there that you could choose instead, which is Tails, right, which is the exact opposite. Chance to block spell damage is unlucky, and chance to block attack damage is lucky, in which case, you know, you could go for like a standard shield setup, because obviously most shields have the chance to block attack damage, and you could scale block based on the node on the tree. But there's also something you could do which kind of aligns with Overly Confident and the whole sort of life stacking, or at least is adjacent to life stacking, and that's strength stacking, using the Iron Fortress. So the Iron Fortress has plus 1% chance to block attack damage per 50 strength, and chance to block spell damage is unlucky. Well, you already have unlucky spell damage if you already took that node on the Gambler. You don't really care about this downside, you're kind of just stacking the same downside again, and you can have plus 1% chance to block attack damage per 50 strength, which means that you could use something like we discussed earlier, you know, Pillar of the Caged God strength stacking with Bloodthirst, for example. You could go for some kind of strength stacking, life stacking setup where you make use of that first node, and you also make use of that second node, cap out your block chance at 75%, and then you also get the lucky modifier coming in there, which means you have a 94% chance to block attacks, which is really, really strong. So, that's it. That's the first two ascendancies that we've been shown off so far. It looks like we're going to be getting more ascendancies here. We actually get some information here. It says, you know, which ascendancies should we showcase next? And they're asking us to vote in the poll. Here is the options here. We got the Daughter of Oshabi, so something Harvest themed there. We got the Servant of Arakali, and also the Disciple of the Trial Master. So, this kind of does look like what I said in the previous video where I discussed what sort of avenues they could go down in terms of designing these ascendancies, and it does look like they're going for looking at previous league mechanics, and also, you know, the Pantheon. I also mentioned that, so I'm really looking forward to seeing what other ascendancies they come up with. These two ascendancies are already really fun. They're going to allow for plenty of theory crafting for builds, and I do share the sentiment over on Reddit. I know there's a post up right now which is to, you know, asking GGG to make the league longer than 1 month. I share that sentiment. I think that it should be longer than a month, because 19 new ascendancies, there's no way you're going to be able to play through and kind of go through a lot of your ideas in that time. So I hope that it's longer than that. But we are left with one more thing in this post at the bottom here, which is, I don't know what this is. It says, one more thing, what is this? And this is like some kind of extra storage space for something. It's attached to the map device, so what this is, I don't know. This could really be anything, some kind of way to modify maps further, who knows. What do you guys think that is right there, and what do you guys think of these ascendancies? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.